Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining the Natural Resources Conservation Service today. To learn more about the easement opportunities under the fiscal year 2026 Regional Conservationist Partnership Program, notice of funding opportunities that were made available on June 23rd. This presentation today will follow up with if you had joined the webinar on June 30th, on the general overview of the notice of funding opportunities. This will be a deep dive into the easement opportunities available. The Easement Programs Division staff today will walk you through this information and will be available for questions once the presentation is wrapped up. If you want the recording or the questions and answers after, those will be posted to grants.gov in the next few weeks. So with that, I will ask for next slide and we'll walk through the agenda. Today's agenda will walk through first the NRCS Chief's priorities. We'll talk about the overview of the Regional Conservation Partnership Program. We'll do a deep dive into the Notice of Funding opportunity, and then we'll provide some wrap-up tips and resources for you, and then adjourn with a question and answer session. So with that, I will ask Ken Creasy, our first presenter, to get started. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Danielle. Next slide, please. So we're going to start today to talk a little about the Chief's priorities for NRCS and highlight the opportunities of how RCPP and the priorities identified in this Notice of Funding opportunity fit within those priorities. So for example, preserve and protect agricultural land. This can be done through RCPP easements. Shift to outcome-based conservation and farmer empowerment. This is a goal of RCPP. Recentering field engagement and technical assistance. As partners, you are bringing forth technical assistance, and that's provided through the agreement, and it is locally led at the field level. Wildlife conservation and outdoor access objectives can be achieved through the easement on RCPP projects. And again, partners are a strength, and so the RCPP program in general just helps achieve that fifth objective of strengthening partnerships. Next slide, please. So before we take a deep dive into the details of this Notice of Funding opportunity, want to take a step back and look at the RCPP program, or the Regional Conservation Partnership Program in general. So just as an overview, just a reminder, so what is the program? It's an opportunity to carry out eligible activities that achieve and further conservation, protection, restoration, and sustainable use of our soils, our waters, wildlife, agricultural lands, and related natural resources on our eligible lands, both at a regional scale as well as a watershed scale. For where, we're focused on eligible land. In that case, we're talking about private lands or tribal agricultural land and non-industrial private forest land or associated land in which the eligible activity could help achieve the conservation benefits as defined in the approved project. Next slide, please. And for how, again, through the RCPP program, NRCS and our partners co-invest in conservation activities to achieve the conservation benefits and address the resource concerns. If you missed the RCPP overview webinar, NRCS hosted on June 26th, it is available on grants.gov at the link provided below. Next slide. So just a reminder, RCPP statute is based on the authorities of the other covered programs at NRCS. I know this table is full of acronyms, and some of you may not be familiar with all of NRCS's Farm Bill programs, but you can look at those programs for additional information. They really inform you as to the activities or what activities can be included in an RCPP project. In essence, under RCPP, we follow the purpose of the covered programs, but we don't follow the rules or specific templates tied to those programs. So for as an example, under RCPP, we have two easement types. Those held by the U.S. government and those held by an entity. But unlike the covered programs that give us the authority, RCPP easements are not tied to the specific land uses under those covered programs. We have more flexibility under RCPP. Next slide. So for opportunities, the first thing that you're going to need to do is select either the classic funding opportunity or the alternative funding arrangement opportunity, and that should be identified at the beginning of the proposal or at the beginning of proposal development. Just as a reminder, under classic, NRCS reimburses participants directly for financial assistance activities. NRCS and the partner negotiate roles in delivering technical assistance to support the producer contracts and easements. And the partner's primary role is to provide outreach, measure impact, and deliver partner contributions to amplify NRCS funding. In contrast, under the alternative funding arrangement, it is the partner who installs practices for producers and reimburses producers for financial assistance activities. It is the partner who delivers all project technical assistance in support of the producer contracts. And NRCS supports limited to non-delegable tasks, such as confirming the eligibility of producers and land and National Environmental Policy Act compliance decisions. Next slide. After you've decided which project type you want to identify or want to work on, you will then need to decide which of the two RCPP funding pools you would like to compete in. Remember that the statute requires us to divide our funding equally between both of these funding pools. And our NFO will always include a note that we intend to fund state, multi-state versus CCA projects with a 50-50 balance of our total annual allocation. So of these two funding pools, again, you can include any RCPP resource benefit or concern under a state or multi-state proposal. If you're identifying a critical conservation area proposal, the project and producer contracts or easements under this project must address at least one critical conservation area specific priority resource concern, and a single proposal cannot include multiple CCAs. More information for this is available on the RCPP website. Next slide, please. So let's dive into a little bit about the differences between the easement opportunities under RCPP. So as mentioned, there are two easement types. There are entity-held easements and our US-held easements. Under our entity-held easements, NRCS provides cost share for the purchase of an easement that is held by an eligible entity. And this option is available under both RCPP Classic and the RCPP Alternative Funding Arrangement. Alternatively, US held easements are purchased and held by the United States by and through NRCS, and this is available only under the RCPP Classic option. Next slide. So what are RCPP roles, or what are the roles of NRCS and partners under these two different easements? So for the activities, when under the RCPP funds for easement purchase, if we are working with an entity-held easement, those funds are provided to the eligible entity as a cost share for the purchase of the conservation easement from an eligible landowner. In contrast, with US held easements, those funds are provided directly to the landowner by NRCS for the purchase of a conservation easement, again, held by the US government. Under the purchase agreement, this is a document between our landowner and eligible entity. It's known as a parcel contract. With the US held easement, that agreement is between the landowner and NRCS directly, and that is called the Agreement for the Purchase of a Conservation Easement. For obtaining the easement and paying for easement acquisition related costs, the eligible entity is responsible for those costs under entity held easements, and NRCS will cover those costs for US held easements. Next slide. In terms of the easement holder, again, the eligible entity is the holder of an entity held easement, and it is the United States by and through NRCS when we are working with US held easements. Co-holders and third-party rights holders are optional under entity held easements, but there are no co-holders and no third-party right holders under US held easements. Next slide. In terms of funds required for easement restoration, under entity held easements, there are no funds provided as part of the easement purchase. Under US held easements, restoration costs must be included in the project budget, and they're not applicable for easements on working lands. For monitoring, stewardship, and enforcement, it is our easement holder, the eligible entity, who will complete those activities for entity held easements, and NRCS has a responsibility of these activities for US held easements. Just a reminder that on entity held easements, the landowners may enroll through other conservation programs, including programs such as land management, the RCPP land management, EQIP, or CSP for the treatment of resource concerns within the easement area. Next slide. In terms of the use of the funds, partner contributions under our for the non-federal share, the easement match for entity held easements closed prior to the PP expiration, those funds can count as a contribution to the RCPP project. For eligible entities' costs for acquisition related items, those may count towards the RCPP project contribution, but they cannot be counted towards the easement match. They're not part of the non-federal share for easement purchase. And reminder for RCP funds, they may not be used for entity-held easement acquisition-related costs or due diligence expenses, such as the appraisal, survey, title, etc. Next slide. So for entity-held easements, who conducts and pays for due diligence? So NRCS responsibilities for entity-held easements are limited to environmental database record search as part of a limited phase 1 environmental site assessment and the appraisal technical review. Partners are responsible for all other due diligence for the purchase and to be provided for them, and they are not reimbursed by NRCS. Next slide. With U.S. held easements, NRCS is responsible for the acquisition of the easement, including obtaining and paying for easement acquisition related items. NRCS will pay up to 100% of the easement acquisition related costs on all U.S. held easement types. And NRCS may also pay up to 100% of the cost of restoration on the easement areas determined by NRCS for highly and moderately restricted easements. Next slide. All technical assistance and financial assistance costs for the RCPP U.S. held easement must be accounted for in the PPA budget. Examples of financial assistance costs include costs of the easement itself, all acquisition-related costs. For highly and moderately restrictive easements, the costs of required restoration activities as determined by NRCS, and for procurement of the baseline documentation report when not prepared by NRCS. As a note, sufficient funds must be available in the PPA budget for the entirety of the easement transaction for a U.S. held easement to be eligible for funding. Next slide. In terms of third-party contributions on U.S. held easements, a partner or other third party may contribute toward the RCPP U.S. held easement in the following ways. They may provide funds or in-kind services for the design and implementation of restoration activities on the easement area. They may provide funds towards management activities, again, on the easement area through an agreement with the landowner. They can provide in-kind services for outreach to private and tribal landowners. And they can provide funds for payment of the easement compensation to the landowner into escrow, but this is an uncommon process. However, under no circumstances will the RCPP warranty easement deed include any rights of enforcement or other interest to another party. All those rights are held by the U.S. government. Next slide, please. Partner funds and qualified in-kind services may be counted as a contribution under the PPA subject to its terms. And there are limitations on landowner contributions. For example, funds contributed by the landowner may not be included as a contribution under the PPA, including but not limited to the difference between the fair market value of the easement and the easement compensation amount paid to the landowner for the easement itself, any actual costs or in-kind services provided by the landowner for restoration or other activities on the easement. Next slide, please. Next, to dive into details of this individual notice of funding opportunity, I'm going to pass it off to Matt Oliver.
Hello, everyone. Hope this finds you well. As Ken mentioned, I'm going to talk about the FY26 NFO for RCPP Classic, and I cover RCPP entity held easements for NRCS. So next slide, please. For starters, the FY26 Classic and Alternative Funding Arrangement NFOs are running concurrently, and they were posted, as Danielle mentioned, on June 23rd. The proposal submission deadline is August 24th at 4:59 p.m. Eastern Time. There is $310 million available in total for both Classic and AFA proposals. And as Ken mentioned earlier, there is a 50-50 split between critical conservation area funding and state or multi-state funding. NRCS is also setting aside $30 million for tribal proposals as well. Next slide, please. So in addition to the agency-wide priorities that Ken talked about earlier, there are specific priorities set forth in the NFO. And so it's important to sort of commit these to memory, because proposals that address one or more of these priorities will be prioritized over, similarly scored proposals in that same funding pool. So we'll start with the first one here. So projects based on land management activities encompassing various areas like soil health, water quality, healthy range and pasture lands, and wildlife habitat, with an aim to improve land health, enhance resource management, and notably to this webinar, promote sustainable agriculture and long-term protection of agricultural, grassland, and forest land viability. Also, farmer-focused projects, particularly with contributions that will provide financial assistance and or technical assistance expertise for planning and practice designs to support producer contracts. Also, soil health projects using practices that focus on minimizing soil disturbance, maximizing soil cover, increasing natural vitality, and maintaining living roots throughout the year. Such NRCS practices often include cover cropping, crop rotation, reduced tillage, surface residue management, grazing management, and notably here, long-term protection of grasslands through entity-held easement activities. Next slide, please. Also prioritize our precision agricultural projects that use precision agricultural technologies to target conservation efforts based on specific field conditions, potentially reducing costs and improving resource efficiency. So this could include precision agriculture technologies in conjunction with conservation practices to ensure optimal land preparation with reduced erosion, enhanced nutrient and pesticide application rates, and timing. And it's also important to note that such precision agriculture projects can be considered on permanently protected landscapes for implementation as well. And as we mentioned earlier, projects led by Indian tribes, NRCS is reserving $30 million for PPAs in that category, and any unused funds there would return to the general funding pool. Next slide, please. All right, so over the next few slides, we're just going to walk right down through the RCPP Classic NFO, beginning with the easement holder and what is available there. So here we have both U.S. held or entity held easements available. For entity held easements, those entities need to meet the requirements in 7 CFR Part 1468.3. That's from the ACEP regulation. Moving on to the deed requirements, starting with entity held easements. You're going to need to attach or incorporate one of 3 sets of minimum deed terms into your own conservation easement, with 2 versions existing for each set, one with the U.S. right of enforcement and one without. Eligible entities can request in their proposal to use a previously approved NRCS easement template for an ACEP ALE-like transaction. And as a reminder, an ALE-like transaction is one that is similar in purpose and deed terms as ACEP ALE. So that would be to protect the agricultural use and future viability and related conservation values, and to be a minimally restrictive deed term. So these sets of minimum deed terms include for the protection of conservation values, that's our highly restrictive set. We have the RCPP minimum deed terms for conservation use with compatible agricultural use. That's our moderately restrictive. And then lastly, we have the RCPP minimum deed terms for agricultural use, which is the minimally restrictive. Moving over to the U.S. held easement side, that includes 3 warranty easement deed types that will need to be tailored to the easement specific purposes. Or alternatively, you can request to use an NRCS pre-approved, pre-populated warranty easement deed, or you could request NRCS approval of a custom deed using the posted materials as a guide and submitted with the proposal. And so similarly here, we have the RCPP warranty easement deed for the protection of conservation values as our highly restrictive. We have the RCPP warranty easement deed for the protection of conservation uses. That's our moderately restrictive. And then lastly, the RCPP warranty easement deed for working lands, which is the minimally restrictive. Next slide, please. Moving on to the durations available. So easements are for either perpetual or maximum duration allowed by state law. It's important to note that currently there are no states that restrict the duration of these easements under RCPP. So really perpetual is the only true option here. Eligible land types include private agricultural land, non-industrial private forest land, and associated land such as riparian areas, floodplains, seasonal or flooded wetlands, and such. Our valuation methodology, so here this is determined through an appraisal. However, an alternative valuation method may be considered if it's included in the proposal prior to the deadline. It's important to note this latter option could delay PPA negotiations and implementation as you work through those approval processes. And prior to proposal submission, applicants seeking an alternative valuation methodology must consult their RCPP state coordinator and the Easement Programs Division valuation team at nrcs.nationalappraisers@usda.gov. And then those approvals would eventually be documented in the PPA and the supplemental agreement type 4. For RCPP compensation, beginning with entity-held easements, NRCS provides a federal share to eligible entities as a percentage of the before and after appraisal or an approved alternative valuation methodology for up to 50% of the easement value with a U.S. right of enforcement and up to 25% of the easement value without a U.S. right of enforcement. For U.S. held easements, NRCS pays up to 100% of the easement value as determined by an NRCS valuation method. Next slide, please. With respect to partner match for entity held easements, this must consist of any combination of landowner donation towards easement value or partner cash contribution towards easement compensation to the landowner. Conversely, for U.S. held easements, we do not have a matching requirement from the partner there. For partner contribution for entity held easements, this does require, of course, a non-federal match, as well as due diligence activities to be performed or procured by the partner. For U.S. held easements, contributions that contribute substantially to the overall costs are highly encouraged. So this is in-kind or cash contributions from sources other than the landowner. Those are the ones that can count. Landowner cost share, whether that's in the form of a landowner donation or charitable contribution, that cannot be counted as partner contribution. Next slide, please. For RCPP award type, beginning with entity held easements, these are implemented through agreements entered into by NRCS with eligible entities that will eventually hold the easement on that eligible land. And then for U.S. held easements, these are implemented through producer contracts entered into directly with eligible landowners. And then lastly, allowed uses for RCPP financial assistance, or FA, for entity held easements. This is provided for the cost of the easement itself, and it's used for NRCS procurement for appraisal technical reviews and environmental database record searches. However, it's important to note RCPP FA for entity held easements may not be used for entity procured due diligence or any other cost. For U.S. held easements, the FA is provided for the cost of the easement itself, for acquisition related costs such as appraisal, survey, due diligence, title, and closing services, and also restoration implementation costs. Next slide, please. Okay, I'm going to hand it off to Tim to talk about the AFA info.
Great, thanks, Matt. I am Tim Aaron, a realty specialist with the Easement Programs Division. And we will, Matt just talked about the classic funding opportunity. I'm going to go through the alternative funding arrangement funding opportunity. Next slide, please. So you'll notice several differences here with the alternative funding arrangements, which is, for one, the easement holder will always be the eligible entity. There are no U.S. held easements under the AFA opportunity. For deed requirements, there's also a difference here. While you can use any of the versions of the minimum deed terms that Matt discussed, you also could use the AFA minimum deed requirements, which allows more flexibility than the minimum deed terms. Another option is to submit with your proposal a previously approved ALE template deed or other proposed custom deed terms. And if you submit those with your proposal, then they would be approved, and then that approval will be documented in the programmatic partnership agreement, as well as the supplemental type 4 easement program agreement. All of the easements under AFA, as in Classic, are perpetual or the maximum duration allowed by law, and I don't believe there is any states that that would restrict the duration of these type of easements, so they would all be perpetual. Eligible land types, again, this mirrors Classic, private agricultural land, non-industrial private forest land, or associated lands. The compensation for the entity-held easements, again, this is similar based on a before and after appraisal, and the cost share, however, is up to 50% of the easement value for a entity-held easement with a U.S. right of enforcement. However, and I believe we'll talk about this on the next slide, but the easements with a U.S. right of enforcement under an AFA are only allowed on ALE-like easements. So that is like a working lands easement that are being acquired by a entity that is already certified under ALE. Other than that option, the easements would not have a U.S. right of enforcement, and therefore only the federal share cap would be 25% of the easement value. Next slide, please. So how is the valuation determined? Generally, that's going to be determined the same way it is under a under Classic, which is through a before and after appraisal. However, if you have an alternative valuation method that you would like to use, that's something that could be considered and should be included in your proposal. And then again, similar to the deed template, if that's approved, then that approval would be documented in the PPA. Partner match requirements must consist of any combination of the landowner donation towards the easement value or partner cash contribution towards the easement payment. And then the partner contribution, well, so again, this is the same as Classic in the sense that the non-federal match would be included as part of the contribution that is required. Let's see, RCPP. Yeah, like I said before, only entity-held easements are permitted under the AFA. Next slide, please. So allowed uses of RCPP financial assistance would be the entity-held easements provide for the cost of the easement itself, cost for NRCS procured appraisal technical reviews and environmental database record searches. The RCPP financial assistance may not be used for entity procured due diligence, such as the title search. As I mentioned earlier, with regards to entities that are certified through ACEP ALE, they may elect to use that certification, may elect to use that certification on ALE-like easements. If you choose to do that, then you would need to be certified at the time the proposal is submitted, and then include within your proposal the alternative processes that you would propose using for the easement acquisition that akin to the alternative processes available under ASAP ALE for certified entities. Those alternative processes would be documented in the PPA and the supplemental agreement type 4. So I just stop there and say, as you may notice, there are a number of things as we went through particularly with the alternative funding arrangement, such as deed templates, alternative valuation methodologies, and using your entity certification status that need to be proposed or need to be, yes, proposed as part of your proposal. So it's something to think about upfront if you would like to take advantage of those opportunities. And then finally, buy, protect, sell transactions are not an eligible transaction type under either the AFA or Classic. Next slide, please. So this is this next few slides will just compare what we go over and summarize what we've already talked about by comparing the 3 different easement opportunities. That is the U.S. held, an entity held under Classic, and the entity held easements under the AFA. So again, the easement holder on the U.S. held is going to be the United States, and then under the entity held will be the entity. The deed requirements, as Matt said, we have 3 deed options, 3 standard deed options under U.S. held, as well as the opportunity to use an NRCS approved pre-populated warranty easement deed. And then for both the Classic and AFA, you may use the minimum deed terms. However, the AFA also has an option of potentially using the minimum deed requirements or a modified ALE template. All of the easements are perpetual or the maximum duration allowed by law, and all of the eligible land types are the same for all 3 programs. Next slide, please. So to recap on the RCPP compensation, that is what the federal share would be. NRCS would pay up to 100% of the easement value on the U.S. helds. On both of the entity held easement programs, it would be a maximum of 25% if there is no U.S. right of enforcement, and up to 50% if there is a right of enforcement. But again, note the difference on the FA, that there is only limited opportunity to have an entity held easement with a U.S. right of enforcement, and that would be only on ALE-like easements acquired by a certified entity. The valuation methodology is the same for all of the easement types. The match requirement, there's no match requirement on the U.S. held, but the match requirement would on both of the entity held easement opportunities would be, again, that would be whatever the landowner is donating in addition to any partner cash contribution made towards that easement payment. Next slide, please. Again, partner contribution to the easement process under Classic, U.S. held, highly encouraged in-kind or cash contributions may count. Landowner donation or charitable contribution by the landowner does not count. Under both the entity held easement programs, the non-federal share match, as well as due diligence activities to be performed or procured by the partner. How are these awarded, the easements under, and how do we enter into the agreement for them? But for Classic, that will be a contract between NRCS and the landowner. Under the Classic and under all of the entity held easements, the agreement is between NRCS and the eligible entity for the purchase of the easement from the landowner. And then Buy, protect, sell, again, is not under these notice of funding opportunities. Buy, protect, sell is not an eligible transaction type. Next slide, please. Allowed uses of FA under Classic that the financial assistance may provide for the cost of the easement itself, acquisition related cost, and restoration and implementation cost. Contrast that with the entity held easements. The financial assistance may be used for the cost share of the purchase of the easement, the NRCS procured appraisal technical reviews and environmental database record searches, but not for entity procured due diligence. And then certification, that is only that is for ALE certified entities. That is only going to be relevant under the AFA easements, entity held easements under the AFA opportunity, and again, if that's used on an ALE like easement, then and you submitted, alternative processes, you may be able to use those as well as receive a cost share up to 50%. Next slide, please. All right, and this here is just kind of recapping what the federal cost shares have been. If you have been around for the past, well, since the beginning of this RCPP, under the 2018 Farm Bill, you may have noticed that the cost share rates have changed slightly from one notice of funding opportunity to the next. So this chart is just trying to kind of summarize where things are now and where things have been. And really the biggest difference here that you'll notice is that while under the the 2023 and 2024 notice of funding opportunities, there was some additional cost share available for entity held easements with historically underserved producers. That is not that additional cost share is not available under the current notice of funding opportunity. So really, we're going back to what the cost share rates that were available in in the initial 2019 notice of funding opportunity. And next slide, please. So finally, just to recap, what are the changes, the biggest changes in these notice of funding opportunities for easement? In Classic, there's a higher prioritization of the protection of agricultural lands through both the entity held and US held easements. You've got the ability to use a modified ASAP ALE template if submitted and requested with their approval. No buy, protect, sell transactions. Again, that is a change from prior notice of funding opportunities. And this last bullet here, that's actually not a change. You could have had entity held easements without a U.S. right of enforcement in prior notice of funding opportunities as well. Next slide, please. The change under the alternative funding arrangement, there's, I guess, some more significant changes here, which is that the easements with the U.S. right of enforcement is only an option for these ALE-like easements. And you've probably heard that over and over again. And really, again, that's, I mean, I guess it is what it says, but it's, if you look at the purpose of the ASAP ALE-like easement, of ASAP ALE easements, an ASAP ALE-like easement is going to be one that has that similar purpose of protecting future use and viability of agricultural land. So again, that is an option only on those ALE-like easements for a certified entity. And another change is that with those types of easements, you can get up to a 50% cost share, and then the ability to use a modified template or an alternative acquisition process, or potentially an alternative valuation. But again, all of those things need to be part of your proposal and then approved and documented in the PPA. And next slide, please. All right, and then finally, here are some resources that will go over some of the things that we talked about in more detail. So there's the RCPP easement resources on there's the ones on the easement webpage, which we've included the link here. And again, this will include information on how to apply for these opportunities. It includes all of the deed terms and some aids that will help you with your proposals, as well as the RCPP appraisal specifications. If you have project or parcel specific questions, those should be directed to your state RCPP coordinator and the state conservationist. However, if you have questions on these presentations, feel free to put those in the Q&A. And next slide. I believe that is it. So thank you very much. If you have any questions, feel free to put those in the Q&A.
All right. Thank you, Tim. We do have a few questions that I think we can read aloud and get some answers provided while we are working on some other answers behind the scene. So I will, I'll start with a question we received. Can you use the RCPP to enroll Healthy Forest Reserve Program, or HFRP, easements in all states? Ken, would you like to provide an answer to this question?
Sure, yes. So RCPP can be used to enroll HFRP-like easements, but it is not a method for the direct enrollment through HFRP. Under RCPP, either RCPP US or NT-held easements may be used to protect eligible forested lands as defined through the project proposal.
Thank you for that answer. Our second question is, does the agricultural land use include areas prioritizing native plantings for first foods for indigenous tribes and/or urban agriculture? Matt, would you like to provide the answer for this question?
Sure. Possibly. To the extent the plant and harvesting of native planting for first foods or urban ag would meet the definition of agricultural use or agricultural land, that's going to depend in part on how that land use is defined in that state code. And to the extent the uses such as planting, harvesting, and cultivation on that individual proposed easement area meets those definitions. Also, RCPP easements are not strictly limited to the production of agricultural use and agricultural land. So a proposal could and should identify the nature and the extent of the land uses, the type of land being proposed for protection under that easement, and any specific eligibility considerations being proposed.
Thank you. I have our next question is, are we able to redefine eligible entities? Matt, would you like to define eligible entities for the audience?
Yes, so eligible entities are state or local government, non-governmental organizations, or Indian tribes that meet the 7 CFR 1468.3 definition that kind of comes from ASAP ALE as it relates to the types of lands you're trying to protect.
Thank you. Our next question is, can the value of a conservation easement be used as a partner contribution in an RCPP Classic project if no NRCS funding is being requested for the conservation easement practices? Tim, would you like to provide this answer?
Sure. The type of easement must contribute to the RCPP project purposes and address the identified resource concerns. But a landowner cost share, such as, for example, like a landowner donation or charitable contribution, cannot be counted as the partner contribution.
Thank you. Our next question is, within an RCPP Classic, can the partner contribution for due diligence be counted towards the RCPP project match? Or is that siloed as required contribution that is not eligible as match? The slide breaks these out separately, suggesting they are treated differently. Matt, would you like to provide the answer to this question?
Sure. So for entity held easements, that requires a non-federal share match, as well as due diligence activities that are performed and procured by the partner. So it doesn't count as match. For U.S. held easements, the contributions that contribute substantially to overall costs are highly encouraged. So that's going to be in kind or even cash contributions from sources other than the landowner. But landowner cost share in the form of a donation or charitable contribution cannot be counted as partner contribution.
Thank you. Our next question is, where are highly, moderately, and minimally restrictive terms defined? Tim, would you like to provide that answer?
Sure. Well, the minimum deed terms, both for the entity held, the minimum deed terms for the entity held easements, as well as the standard warranty easement deeds used for the U.S. held easements, are available on the RCPP website. That link that I shared, I think, in the previous slide. Regarding the what the deeds are themselves, and as far as the deed terms, our referring to them as minimally restrictive, moderately restricted, and highly restrictive is really a shorthand reference that we use. Actually, if you look at the at least with respect to the entity held easements, for example, the minimally restrictive deed terms are actually the deed terms for the protection of agricultural use. The moderately restrictive deed terms are minimum deed terms for conservation use with compatible agricultural uses, and the highly restrictive deed terms are the deed terms for the protection of the conservation values. And so, but internally and when speaking with partners, we often refer to them as highly, moderately, or minimally restrictive terms. But again, that's just the shorthand.
And thank you for that explanation and trying to share a little more on how we use certain terms within the agency. Our next question, with the alternative funding arrangement and certified entities and right of enforcement, am I hearing correctly that we cannot do moderately restrictive easements? Tim, can you provide that answer?
So for I'm sorry, am I hearing correctly that correct for an AFA certified entity with I guess there would be one circumstance where you could use a moderately restrictive easement, and that is if it were a ALE like grassland protection easement, and then potentially you would use the moderately restrictive deed terms, but it's still going to need to be ALE like in that it's protecting the agricultural use.
Thank you. So just as a clarifying point, the question was, where is the link for the first webinar recording posted? If it is posted, it doesn't appear on the link on slide 6. I'll just provide that the recording has not been made available yet. NRCS is working through the posting requirements, and that those will then be posted and provided in the near future. Right. We are trying to catch up on a few questions and answers. So we'll see um, what we have available to point to next. Is there technical assistance money available for organizations applying under Classic to pay for staff time to secure easements? Let's see, would Tim, would you like to tackle that question?
A minute here. Yeah, sorry, I was looking at to be. Is there TA money available for organizations applying under Classic to pay for staff time? I believe the answer to that is no.
Yep, thank you. Regarding the alternative funding arrangement, does the lead partner need to be the entity certified through ASAP ALE, or could a contributing partner who would also be the easement holder, who needs to be the certified entity through the agricultural land easement program, hold the ASAP ALE like easements? Matt, would you like to answer that question?
Yes, I don't believe it has to be the lead partner. I think they need to be the on that particular individual parcel contract, but I don't think they have to necessarily be the lead partner for the project.
Yeah, so they need to be named as the holder or the co-holder on that individual project, is what you're conveying.
Yes, correct.
Let's see. So, Tim, with the RCPP alternative funding arrangements and the certified entities with a U.S. right of enforcement, can processes be proposed that do not require the review of due diligence, like the review of the deed if you have a previously approved template at the time of proposal, no review of minerals, environmental appraisal, etc.? What does the approval process look like for a certified entity in an alternative funding arrangement with a U.S. right of enforcement?
Yeah. I guess it can look. I mean, it's going to look like however it gets proposed. That we don't have a set. Unlike, let's say, ALE certification, where there is a set process, alternative process. It's more flexible here. You're the driver and are going to propose what the process looks like. That said, you certainly could propose the same types of flexibilities that are present under ASAP ALE for certified entities, which would, as you know, some of the suggestions in here, like a limited review of the deed, meaning we only are really reviewing the deed to make sure that the landowner names and entity names are correct, and very basic review like that. Again, same thing with the title review. So yes, I mean so I guess in short, it can look very similar to ALE certified processes, but you can also propose something else. If you have another idea of some type of flexibility or process that you'd like to propose, you certainly can propose that, and that could be part of the negotiation with NRCS when entering the PPA.
Great. So the key here is to put it as part of your proposal if this
Correct.
is a process you would like to look at.
That's correct.
Thank you. All right. Matt, entity certification was available for entity held easements under Classic RCPP in fiscal 25. Under the current NFO, certification is only available under the alternative funding arrangement. Why was this change made? Are there many certified entities that would like to use their certified status? Sorry, the spreadsheet just jumped on me. For a variety of reasons, but the alternative funding option is not an ideal fit for the entity held easements.
Yeah, so it's still, go ahead. Did you?
Nope, that was
Yep,
it.
okay.
It just jumped on me again. So I think I've gotten it all wrapped up now.
Yeah, well, it's still an option, and I believe it fits better under the alternative funding arrangement since it is an alternative sort of acquisition method. So still available, still there, using the U.S. right of enforcement for this round of NFOs.
Yeah. So we did just make it available under the alternative funding arrangement as a way to really showcase under the alternative funding arrangement, the entities being able to take full control of those projects, which is what the agency is looking for under those alternative funding arrangements. Let's see. You've mentioned multiple resource concerns in your application. If you mention multiple resource concerns in your application, does each entity held easement have to address all of the resource concerns mentioned in the application, or can you select just one applicable resource concern based on the property type? Matt, would you like to address this question?
Yes, sure. So not every easement has to address every single resource concern in your project, but each individual easement needs to address naturally at least one or more, but you don't have to try and capture them all in each individual easement.
Okay. Tim, would you like to add on the critical conservation area requirements?
I was, yeah. So while Matt is correct, there's one caveat there, which is if you are applying for one of the critical conservation area funding pools, then your easement would have to have at least one of those priority resource concerns would have to be addressed in your easement. So you could have multiple of the priority resource concerns listed in the application. The easement has to address at least one of those.
Thank you. For an RCPP alternative funding arrangement, would a custom deed included in our proposal still be subject to the alternative funding arrangement minimum deed requirements? Tim, can you address that?
Would a custom deed included in our still be subject to the AFA? Well, I mean, if a custom deed is included in your proposal, I mean, practically speaking, what we're going to do is look at it versus the AFA minimum deed requirements and see that it's incorporating those, because those AFA minimum deed requirements are very similar to the statutory or the regulatory deed requirements for ALE. But yes, we would. I mean, we would be reviewing that deed at the time of your proposal to ensure that it meets the minimum requirements, which is effectively going to be that yes, it's following those AFA minimum deed requirements.
All right, thank you. Matt, I'm going to ask you to think about this question while I read it. For moderately restrictive grassland entity-held easements, are we required to follow the Grasslands of Special Environmental Significance certification? In many states, the Grasslands of Environmental Special Concern certification has been a high bar that is very challenging to meet in practice. Can these easements under RCPP have some trees or cropland?
So for a moderately restrictive, that's not specifically directly analogous to a GSS. So it's going to be how you craft your proposal on the type of grassland you're looking to protect is going to feed into, your eligibility and things like that. So it's not, it's not a one-to-one, a moderately restrictive deed is analogous directly to a GSS. So it's going to be partially dependent on how you craft that proposal.
Great, thank you. There's a couple questions here that we will provide written answers on because we'll coordinate with the RCPP team when we have an opportunity. But I will, Matt, if you can, or we can address this question. Can entity-held easements under an alternative funding arrangement close using an advance payment? Or is reimbursement the only option under an alternative funding arrangement?
Yes, you should be able to do an advance payment under a certified acquisition alternative process.
Yeah. So just as clarity, easements are allowed to provide that advance payment to a title agent's escrow account. That is how the process would work for any of the types of easements we do under these programs. Let's see. Tim, can NRCS accept a U.S. held highly restrictive RCPP classic easement without mineral rights?
Without mineral rights. I'm not sure I understand the question, but I mean, if the question is whether or not we could do a U.S. held easement, highly restrictive U.S. held easement where the minerals are severed from the property, then yes, we could do that. It really depends on what the purpose of that easement is, whether the severance of the severed mineral rights, whether those are likely to be exercised by another party, that's a third party that's going to undermine the purposes of that easement. But there is no blanket rule that we can't acquire an easement where the mineral rights have been severed.
Thank you. Our next question is, under what circumstances, if any, is NRCS willing to waive the adjusted gross income for producers and landowners in the partnership agreement negotiations? Ken, would you like to provide us this answer today?
Yeah, thanks. So a partner may request a waiver of the applicability of AGI for the whole project, or a landowner may individually request a waiver of the AGI limitation on an individual basis. NRCS does have the authority to waive the AGI limitation for projects of special environmental significance. This is an individual determination based on the specific environmental attributes of the easement itself.
Thank you. I think so. We have a question on the alternative funding arrangement versus classic. This participant hasn't found a reason to consider the alternative funding arrangement for easements, but now they can see some potential benefits related to certified entities. Can we advise on any other scenarios where the alternative funding arrangements may be preferable?
I can hop in here, Danielle. I mean, I guess a couple of possibilities would be that you want to use a different process for, like it was mentioned, that you're a certified entity. You want to use a streamlined process that doesn't require, that's not using as much NRCS oversight on the acquisition process, or perhaps you want to use a previously approved template, ASAP ALE template, or if you have an alternative valuation methodology that you want to use. It's really, and if you're seeing a theme It's that, we're offering more, the AFA is offering you more flexibility to make this kind of you're in the driver's seat and driving the acquisition more so than under Classic. And so if you have some creative thoughts on how you want to do the acquisition or what the deed you want to use or how you want to do the valuation, AFA might be the right way to go because it offers the ability for us to come to agreement on those flexibilities.
Thank you for that answer. Let's see. There is like I said, there's a couple questions in here that we will provide in writing as we can coordinate with the larger RCPP team. There is, let's see if there's anything else that is jumping out for, I know questions are continuing to come in, so we're working on those. Is there a minimum grant request amount? I think this is for the proposal, perhaps, and I do not know if there is a minimum request that to be part of your proposal, but there is a maximum request as you read the notice of funding opportunities. Great. Looks like most of our questions have slowed down. So we'll just give it a minute for other questions to come in and see if we can get some of those addressed.
Hey, Danielle, there was a question on the timeline for appraisals that I don't think we hit. We can probably answer.
Let me
Is there
scroll back up to that.
I think it was, yeah. I mean, I can just say it if you want.
Okay.
It says, is there a timeline for appraisals? Do they go stagnant the way they do for ASAP ALE projects? So I will address both the ASAP ALE and RCPP, which both have the same guidelines with respect to appraisal effective dates, which is that the appraisal effective date must be no sooner than 12 months prior to the date that the parcel contract is executed. After that, it could go all the way any time up to closing of the easement. So as long as your appraisal is not older than a year old when you enter into the parcel contract, it will not go stagnant. And again, that is the same rule under ASAP ALE. I will also just note that if there is any confusion of that, it may be because if you are currently have a RCPP Type 4 supplemental agreement, you'll notice in there it says 6 months rather than 12 months. If that is something that is an issue for your project on one of those existing program agreements, those can be modified. You can work with your state RCPP coordinator to modify that term so that it is 12 months rather than 6 months. But no, they do not go stagnant as they previously did under ALE.
Thank you for pulling that question back up to the top. Appreciate that. Um, so we have a question. Can RCPP fund U.S. easements for endangered species listed, or for the Endangered Species Act listed federal species, sage grouse, and associated grasslands, which would be consistent with the project goals and resource concerns, one of which would be terrestrial habitat? Ken, can you answer that question for us?
Sure, yes. So the short answer is yes. You would just want to define all those purposes as you stated as the goals and resource concerns within the project proposal, and then ensure that that will get incorporated into the easement deed terms and the appropriate deed selected. So short answer, yes.
Thank you for that. Okay. So we have a question on RCPP alternative funding arrangements. If they could utilize a geographical area rate cap in their proposal for evaluation or for valuation methodology, help us to understand how this might work. So in the notice of funding opportunity for the alternative funding arrangements, we do identify that an alternative valuation methodology may be presented as part of your proposal. And so as part of that, you'd want to describe what that alternative valuation methodology is and also submit that proposal to our national appraisers during this proposal timeline. So prior to the end of the NFO, so that that can be evaluated and looked at. And so if your project is then selected, that could become a part of your partnership agreement as you move forward through the process. So it will really depend on what it is, the goals of the easement proposal are and how that would meet the alternative valuation methodology. Right. It looks like maybe we've caught back up on questions. I'll just ask the presenters, is there a question I've missed that you would like to address that I may have skipped over accidentally?
I see one, Danielle, which is, could an entity held easement under an AFA close via advance payment, or is reimbursement the only option under AFA? No, there's no, advance is available under an AFA as well. It's available under either classic or AFA. The only circumstance I can think of where reimbursement was the only option was under buy, protect, sell, which, as we discussed, is not an available transaction type under these NFOs.
Thank you, Tim. Right. That it looks like maybe we are close to hitting the end of questions and wrapping up. And again, as we work to close out the presentation today, the recording will be able to be provided through grants.gov along with the written question and answers that we can get the full set to you in writing posted also. So I will just say thank you all for joining us this week to learn more about the easement opportunities under the Regional Conservations Partnership Program. We look forward to reading your proposals and getting back to you soon.